You don't have to be a die-hard birder to recognize this call. Walk in any forested area in Manitoba, and it likely won't be long before you hear the familiar call of the chickadee. It's also fairly commonly known that chickadees got their name from their chickadee-dee-dee call. Living in a part of the world where English is the dominant language, anytime I've wanted to know the name of a new bird, or any specific information, like how a bird got its name, I have almost limitless ways of accessing that information. But what if the language you spoke didn't have countless books and websites dedicated to providing you the information? And what if you were staring at a bird that you see migrating through your territory every year, and no one in your community even knew what it was called? My name is Jonny B with CKUW 95.9 FM here in Winnipeg, Manitoba on Treaty 1 territory. Colonization and residential school system that shamed and punished Indigenous people across Turtle Island for speaking their language did severe damage, and its impacts are ongoing. But my guests today have been working and traveling tirelessly for years to seek out the names of birds in Anishinaabe and assemble that knowledge to ensure that the language will be there for generations to come. Creator's Garden is a project started by Joseph Pitawanakwat and is based out of the area now known as Peterborough, Ontario. And earlier this year, they published a pamphlet that covers some of the Anishinaabe names for birds and describes what those names mean. The pamphlet is now available for purchase through their website, creatorsgardenmarket.ca. I got the chance to speak with him, as well as his colleagues Andres Jimenez and Junaid Khan, about the pamphlet, about the lengths they have to go to uncover and recover these bird names, and about the future for this very important work. It was an honor to chat with them and listen to their stories, and I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, let's cut right to that interview. Okay, so welcome, folks. I do programming about birds, so I came across your work through the Indigenous Bird Names pamphlet, the Anishinaabe Bird Names. And I know that Creator's Garden as a project and you all as individuals have interests beyond birds, but I'm wondering if you could quickly introduce yourselves and how you first got interested in birds and maybe the origins of Creator's Garden. Maybe I'll start with you, Joe.
Sure. Yeah. So real simple, real quick. I kind of accidentally started learning about plant medicines, Anishinaabe from my grandma, just mostly because I thought it was a fascinating thing that she grew up and she raised a bunch of her kids without a hospital. So to me, those were just really fascinating stories about how she had to use plants. And when me and my wife found all of these different plants, my community started to take them from me, and I would see the effects of those plant medicines on people when they would get them off of me, and that really quickly spiraled into making tons of medicine for people, and then teaching large groups, and then uh, and then all of a sudden I was getting like 3 oil changes every month, getting invited to dozens of communities every month, speaking in front of thousands of people, um, uh, sometimes in a week. So I found myself anywhere and everywhere where plant medicine was valuable. I was there teaching. But it's kind of funny now, I like being a little bit more explicit about it now, but I mean, I kind of could care less about plants for the longest time. They were not really fascinating to me really at the time, because I was it just kind of fell on my lap that this responsibility of teaching, just because of how effective they were as a form of therapy. So I kind of started swindling this as an opportunity, because one thing that I have always been really obsessed with is birds, not really investing a lot into learning about them. So, but just really fascinating by their lifestyles, all of the different sounds that they make. So I always grew up appreciating birds. So when I would be invited to teach into a community about medicines, I would kind of one of the things that would determine which community I would choose to go and teach is the community who was able to ensure some of the participants were Indigenous bird knowledge experts. So I, in my negotiations in going to communities to teach about medicines, I always made sure that there was somebody there who represented Indigenous bird knowledge, so I could at least learn their names. So now I'm going to hundreds of communities, hundreds of institutions all over Ontario and beyond into the States, and spending time with as many people who were as knowledgeable about birds as possible. and that led me to, well, it actually didn't lead to nothing. I was just making lists on my phone and having fun learning about birds from other people. And it wasn't until I met some of our other team members. I met Andres first in Costa Rica, and we kind of shared some ideas and shared our passion for understanding birds, and that just us meeting, I guess, really kind of spiraled into realizing the potential of creating a project out of this, and kind of formalizing it in a way to be able to have educational materials or something. It was Andres that kind of saw something really valuable here to be able to present and share with people who realizing, I guess, that most birders would probably actually really want to learn from, indigenous perspectives and our knowledge on all of these different birds. And so, yeah, we just kind of spiraled into doing everything we could to take my community work and kind of, I guess, essentially my community research, and kind of structure it in a way that will best serve as educational materials so that everyone can learn the values of indigenous bird knowledges.
I'll go next. That was a fantastic story. Everything but quick and simple, but a fantastic story. I'm Andres Jimenez. I am a Costa Rican biologist living in Canada. I am an accidental birder, but I am an everywhere birder. I started birding when I started working with Birds Canada. Well, I started when I was very young, when I first saw a Montezuma oropendola, and then I kind of just ID the birds that will call up to my attention. And then I came to Canada, started working with Birds Canada, and that was the perfect reason to start working with birds. And someday I met Joe in Costa Rica, and then we went looking for skinks in Canada. And I really wanted to see a skink because I was originally a herpetologist. And I was talking to him and I was like, Joe, I think we should do an Anishinaabe bird guide. And then he said, let's do it. And we really needed a writer. And we found a very good writer that happened to be a birder and that was learning Anishinaabe for the past 2-3 years, who was very connected with speakers and who was very connected with people that could double check our resources and the quality of our Anishinaabe, and that was Junaid.
Yes, hello, hi, it's me. My name is Junaid Khan. I've been in the realm of biology for about 12 years. It started off with researching coyote poop in Cochrane, Alberta, and it evolved into research about invasive fire ants, and I've worked on seabird research and microplastic pollution research, and bounced around in pollinator conservation and native habitat creation for the last 4 or 5 years. And amongst all of that, I think I just have a very deep love for all kingdoms of beings, perhaps other than humans. But I'm working on it. Some of them are real cool too. And in that work, I came to recognize that, there's so many languages you learn when you're training to become, a biologist or a scientist in some field. There's lingo in that field. In the field of birds is typically scientific names. And as I was going through this process of naming and names, I was doing research on how to disentangle colonial relationships from how to learn science. And all the resources I would read would always have like this one sentence in like many pages that would, quote some knowledge keeper or elder saying like, the language is very important. And that was kind of it. Like, then we moved on. But recognizing how important language is to culture really linked with me when my mom said to me that, I went and saw this friend of mine. She's been living here for 25 years and she still doesn't speak like full English. And somehow in that moment, all of that stuff crystallized in my head. And I was like, I don't speak a word of any Indigenous language from Ontario. And so that began my journey of trying to learn Anishinaabe. And that journey took me to this project and so much more. So that's me.
Right on. Thanks for that. So now this pamphlet was published and came out, I think, earlier this year. But I imagine like the work, the research, the interviews, and all that is sort of like an ongoing project. Does this pamphlet have everything that you've come up with, or is this just sort of like a pamphlet size thing? And what's been the response that you've had since the pamphlet's sort of been put out?
When we first got together, we consolidated all of the work that I have done in all of the communities that I've been to, and consolidated everything kind of into one document. And I think we're at like 150 or 170 species of birds or something like that. So it was a lot, but we wanted to have like we wanted to create like a proof of concept. So Birds Canada was our vehicle that provided us with the opportunity to create the first pamphlet, which is our, just serves as like a proof of concept. When we were constructing the pamphlet, we wanted to make sure that it had all of the different elements that Anishinaabe names of birds capture. So we wanted to make sure we had aquatic species, birds of prey, songbirds. We wanted to have a good cross-section of the different types of birds, but we also wanted to be able to express all of their different attributes. So the birds that have very specific nesting patterns, nesting patterns, different unusual behaviors, of course, Anishinaabe names that emulate the way the bird looks. So pamphlet was a proof of concept for a larger project opportunity, which I think is to eventually have educational materials in different forms that have as many of the names as we can capture. I think the most important part of the important part of the project that was introduced with the pamphlet is like a kind of citizen science project component of it, where I only have 170 species that I've been able to capture, but we probably in Ontario anyways would be dealing with like 450 species of birds that are here. And with the work that we've been able to do right now with this birds pamphlet, this whole project is the Anishinaabe names of birds are capturing something so special and unique. I think it's just a basic kind of taxonomic responsibility is to give somebody an opportunity to positively identify a creature. Anishinaabe is not really that much different, but the way that we choose to do it is different, different than scientific or common taxonomy procedures. In Anishinaabe, when we seem to really have a very, very, very good understanding of each individual species. Like there's clearly thousands of years of careful observation that allowed us the ability to apply certain names to species. Like maybe we could even just speak about one. I think one that I'm most excited to share in our next pamphlet.
Let me guess.
Which one do you think?
Canada J.
That's exactly the one that I wanted to say. It's the coolest thing in the world. Okay, so here with the Canada J, there's a whole process to actually being able to figure out which Anishinaabe name applies to which specific species. So we have an entire methodology that every name kind of goes through a pretty rigorous process, I think, so that we make sure that we fully understand exactly who we are talking about. So sometimes we're faced with these moments where we have two different bird names, like one that I want to say now is Blue Jay and Canada Jay. Those seem to be interchangeable in communities that we go to. So some people will call a Canada Jay Queen Gleesh, and some people will call a blue jay Dindasi. And sometimes it's the exact opposite. Some communities will say a Canada jay is Dean Desi and a blue jay is Queenglish. It just seems to be interchangeable, but we have this idea that I think every species of bird is such an accurate portrayal or description of that captures the essence of that creature. So they all go through this methodology with the language experts that we work with. My mommy, we were trying to tease out who is Dean Desi and who is Queenglish. And we know both of these are probably mostly going to be talking about blue jays and Canada jays. And so Dean Desi, we're looking at the name of this bird, and Desi is your belly button, or like an umbilical cord that keeps you attached to your mommy. And so you hear other words within that word, and so that gives us hints and clues to understand who that name is describing. And so Dean Desi is we can hear some elements of connection and disconnection and some real world comparisons, like an umbilical cord, which we call Desi. And then Queenglish is another bird, either a Canada jay or a blue jay. We got to figure out which species this belongs to. And so Queenglish, when we reached out to our language expert, my mom, we said, what do you think, Queenglish, what is this describing? What sounds do you hear, and what do these sounds mean when they're all put together to say Queenglish? And my mom texted back in like 2 minutes, and she was like, it sounds kind of gross. She was like, it sounds like there's a bunch of fluid coming out of somebody's face and it's getting stuck on something. Queenglish. It's kind of like not spitting, but it's a little bit more unusual of a sound. There's something coming out of your face and getting stuck on something. And so here we have these two kind of descriptions of what those two Anishinaabe names are trying to capture. One has to do with connection and disconnection, and a belly button or an umbilical cord, and then one has to do with a bunch of fluids coming out of somebody's face and getting stuck on something. And so now our job is to figure out exactly which species each of these words are talking about, so that we could determine once and for all kind of who is Dean Desi and who is Queenglish. What's the name for a blue jay and what's the name for a Canada jay? So that's when the biologists come into play, where we have to work with Andres and Junaid, who are experts in bird behavior, and different characteristics, and also research experts. If there's a question about a specific bird, they're going to be the ones that figure it out. So now we have these two descriptions, and they were able to figure out and understand exactly who was a blue jay and who was a Canada jay.
That's amazing to hear all the work that's going into all of this. Junaid, do you have some thoughts on that?
The response to the first pamphlet has been somewhat overwhelming. We have orders that we have not yet gotten to, and that's just because all of us have full-time other jobs that we also do. But it's been a wonderful, as Joe said, sort of proof of concept of what can be done. And yeah, there is a lot more work, as Joe just mentioned. Just two names took us like the better part of an afternoon to sit and dissect and sort of reflect on, and then connect with language experts and connect with Andres and research. So yeah, there is a fair bit that goes into figuring each of these out.
Yes, I remember when we were defining who was the Canada jay and who was the blue jay. As you might remember from the start of the interview, I'm not the Anishinaabe speaker, so every time I need to remember Anishinaabe name, I struggle so much. I literally repeat them for ages until these two are completely out of their mind and bored of me saying the same name once and again. So give me a name for the Canada jay.
It's Canada jay is Queenglish.
I remember that Joe called me and asked, "Hey man, what do you think, what characterizes a Canada Jay?" And I didn't know much about Canada Jays, so I hit the internet and I started looking for them and I go like, "Joe, what does Wingwish mean? And do you think it has to do with saliva?" And then he writes to his mom and he goes like, "In 2 minutes, she just said slime and saliva." And we were like, "Yeah, this is it." And as it happens, Canada Jays, to store food, they grab all their food items and they lick them and they cover them with saliva and then they attach them to parts of the vegetation that are above the snow line so they can access those items during the winter. And that's how they store a lot of their food, using saliva, which is very sticky and attaches the food items to the vegetation. And that's how we discovered that Wingwish was the Canada Jay. Did I pronounce that correctly? Please say yes.
Yeah, yeah, perfect. And then
Yeah.
the Blue Jays, Dean DeC, we found another really interesting characteristic about the Blue Jay, and about that connection and disconnection and umbilical cord, kind of as a reference point. Blue Jays, I guess, are very well known for being loud and obnoxious and big and in large groups everywhere that they go all year, except when they have kids. When they're racing their young, they're
Huh.
completely silent and you'll almost never see them. You'll think all of the Blue Jays are gone, but they're not gone. If you have a keen eye, you could always go and find them. You just realize that they have just completely separated themselves from everything that is happening so that they could raise their kids. And so Dean DeC, is a very appropriate name for a Blue Jay, and Guinguish is capturing a very important and unique, defining characteristic of a Canada Jay. So this whole process between my community work, biologists, that were partnered with Andres and Junaid, and then as well a panel of language experts. We hope to be able to apply this method to as many species of birds as we can, capturing hopefully more species of birds with the genealogy project, and then as well the citizen science portion of everything that we're doing.
So
Genealogies are going to be fun. If you don't know, when the Anishinaabe people are born, one of the ways that we name our children is just whatever is happening around us when that child is born. That's what their name is. So you see lots of weather terms. Even my last name, Pitawanakwat, Bidankwat, is when it's a blue sky and there's some clouds that are coming in and you will soon be covered. That's Bidankwat, when clouds are coming in. And then in one interpretation, I guess. And then bird names are very, very common in the Anishinaabe naming process, because whatever is happening when that person is born, that's what their name is. A lot of the times you get birds that are calling. And so people carry the names of birds often. And if you go through genealogies, you see a lot of bird names. And so we plan to go through those and hopefully capture more names of species to apply this method to be able to know exactly what species of bird that name belongs to.
I think at
But
this
yeah, it's all
point,
fun.
yeah, I think at this point it's really important for the listener to know that we need to do this because people tend to think, or I used to think, that every time Joe shared an indigenous name is because an indigenous knowledge keeper told him that bird is called Wingwizi. And then that's it. And it's pointing to the bird and that's it. But that's not the case. In the majority of cases, Joe just gets a whole bunch of names that might belong to a bird, but we don't know to which bird. And this person might know this name from their uncle that told them about a bird that they were listening and they never saw the bird. And so this is a game of trying
Yeah.
to match the names with the actual bird species. And in another thing I want to say is I want to thank Birds Canada, Wiikwemikoong Nation, and Environment and Climate Change Canada for supporting us on trying to get this pamphlet out of the ground, because this was the first test of this process that, as Joe envisions, when it's mature, is going to be an online portal with citizen science where people can contribute names. It's going to be an investigation into Anishinaabe genealogy, and then it's also going to be several different resources that can be used for learning the language.
Great to hear all that the background work that goes into, so folks like myself are just looking at this two-sided pamphlet, and it's like an amazing resource that you can read, through in about a couple of minutes. Obviously, it's something you reference back to, but obviously a lot more work goes into that behind the scenes. So it's interesting that you mention that you bring up jays, because prior to reading this Anishinaabe Bird Names pamphlet, the one Anishinaabe, or I think Anishinaabe bird name that I knew was, it's anglicized to whiskey jack, which is known as like the Canada jay around these parts, northwestern Ontario and Manitoba. Is that a term that you've heard at all? Does that mean something different to you?
Yeah, for sure, man. That was so much fun. So whiskey jack is the anglicized version of the Cree word used to describe that bird. I think
Cree. Okay.
yeah, it's Cree. And so like with Anishinaabe and Cree, they're so very similar languages. With most bird species so far, like since we've released a pamphlet, lots go out to Cree communities because they all have essentially pretty much the same names for birds, like where we might say mong shan for a loon, they will say mong. It's the same. So a lot of the bird names are the same, but I think it's fascinating, so fascinating when there is a very similar language like Anishinaabe and Cree that describe the same bird, but with different names. That gives us a bigger or more broader insight into the observations that have taken place for that particular species. And I think a lot of it has to do with breeding patterns, like when we might be in the migratory section of birds that are going much farther north, where we might not see breeding behaviors, but northern communities would be able to experience breeding behaviors, and that might be the unique characteristic that defines that species for them up there. But for us here, they pass by, we see them every year, and we will have a different name that captures a different essence. So I think, another part of our project that we really want to consider is exploring all of the other territories that this bird is known, that birds are known to stop by, and what do they call it, like in more southern parts of Anishinaabe territory. I don't know, what are we thinking, like a ruddy duck is we call a ruddy duck based on the display that it has, maduan sheep, because they make a song with their feathers. But a lot of the communities in the south will describe that bird with a different feature.
It's neat to consider, what goes into a name and why that would be different. Andres, I'm wondering if I can throw a question your way. This all the talk of sort of like different names in different communities. I know I've heard amongst Spanish speakers that it would be hard to ever produce a field guide in Spanish because there are just dozens and dozens of names for like a single species of bird across, like Central America. Is this process like in learning the Anishinaabe names? Are there any parallels in terms of what you know about Spanish names for birds that you're seeing when you're involved in this project?
Never seen, heard, or experienced such a complicated and elaborate way of naming creatures. There is a deep understanding of that creature's essence in order to name it. In some cases, you have names that are onomatopoeic, and so it is the sound that names the bird. But in many other cases, it requires deep observation, like it was with the Canada jay, to see how they behave, to understand what is the very specific characteristic that defines them. I haven't seen this in Spanish. Interestingly enough, the last time Junaid and I were in Costa Rica, we spent some time with some indigenous people from the Bribris, and we decided to ask them if they knew about migratory birds. And apparently there wasn't much knowledge associated to the idea of birds migrating. So
I would love it if at some point we could actually take this project on the road and go to Central and South America and North America closer to Mexico to see how indigenous peoples there understood migratory birds that connected with Canada.
That would be an amazing project. Yeah, yeah. Junaid, maybe I'll throw the next question to you. Do you have an example of learning a name for a bird in Anishinaabe and then either connecting it to an experience you've had with that bird that really resonated, or the opposite, where you've heard or like a lot about a bird and then you've gotten the Anishinaabe name and you're like, oh, that makes so much sense?
Yeah, so we started this conversation by telling Joe that we saw two new species, and both of those are shorebirds. And I have a particular space in my heart for shorebirds. They're adorable, they're weird, they can be incredibly beautiful. They're very nuanced, even though they inhabit this very specific habitat. Their shorebirds differ all over. And it's incredible that these species, exist from all the way much farther south from us and then go and, mate much farther north. And so in one of our sort of Joe unveiling a bunch of names and me writing them down and sort of cross-analyzing them and then putting down thoughts, I learned the name for the killdeer, which is Jichishkwe. And that was super cool, was learning about this bird. And Joe was like, so we got this other name that's Mushkode Jichishkwe. And it's describing something like a fire that's just been burned, like almost the embers of a fire that just like finished. And Jichishkwe, we assume and we're fairly certain is talking about the killdeer. And what kind of shorebird needs fire? And so he sent this message to our little group chat, and my immediate reaction was, well, that's a dunlin. Because there's a species I find super fascinating, but they have very unique breeding plumage where their stomachs form kind of deep black and their upper bodies are very reddish, which surprisingly works as really good camouflage against like a lot of the pebble beaches that dunlins will be on. But seen on beaches in Ontario, in contexts of very fine sand or very gray rocks, they look like kind of a very recently finished fire that's still kind of glowing. And yeah, that was just one of a dozen moments, but one of the things that really continues to inspire me to deepen my learning of Anishinaabe, but really like languages in general, is that in Anishinaabe, indigenous languages in general, in Anishinaabe, each sound has a very specific meaning and context, and that context changes based on what other sounds it's paired with and grouped with. And so you can really gain much deeper levels of understanding of a species the more you look into a name. And so, chickadees are named or called Jigajiganishi or Jigajiganishi. And you can hear the onomatopoeia there that Andres mentioned earlier. You can hear, similar to the common name nomenclature, chickadee, you're trying to mimic its sound. It's so emblematic, it's hard almost not to. But breaking apart the word and understanding, the components within it will also help you see that Jigajiganishi is talking about jig, which is the process of kind of like turning over, hiding. And chickadees have an incredibly phenomenal memory for seed storage in their environments. Not only can they store thousands of seeds in an environment, but they can remember where they have cached them and whether or not that cache has been used. And so this behavior of storing seeds, it's not unique to chickadees, but they do it at a level that is better and more complex than other seed storing birds or seed caching birds that we know around here. And that memory part is very unique to them. And so that name is not only onomatopoeic, but it's also talking about a very particular behavior that this bird does, this almost compulsive storing that it needs to do that is necessary for its life. Yeah, those are just like the two that come to mind. But yeah, there's lots.
Yeah, chickadees were at like 80,000 seeds stored per year. They adjust the size of their hippocampus up to, was it like almost 30% as they store the seeds? Their memory grows, and as they eat the seeds, their memory shrinks, or their brain size will grow and shrink throughout the year. So that feature to hiding all of the to caching seeds, yes, is very a perfect name for a chickadee. But then you also have the weird onomatopoeia. Yeah, exactly. And then Junaid doesn't even give himself credit. This guy, I have this podcast. I'll find the name of it in a second. But there's this podcast my community does, or some members of my communities do. It's on Spotify. It's called Wiikwemikoong 49er Project, and they must have like half a dozen episodes on there now. It's fully in the language. These people go around to my community and record stories from people, fully in the Anishinaabe. And I played one in the car. Me and Junaid were going somewhere. I don't know where we were going, but I played one in the car. And this guy understood the story, understood my language, and understood what these people were talking about. This guy is as deep as you could possibly be into really trying to learn my language. And yeah, soon I guess it will be his as well. And so for me, part of this language project that makes it a little bit more personal is I think a resource that we're creating is one of the motivations behind it is that we want to inspire people to really understand how valuable, deep, and rich Anishinaabe is, or our language is. And for me, like, Junaid is making this like a contest now. He's enrolled in like every online virtual Anishinaabe class that you could possibly be in.
Joe is turning it into a contest in his own mind. I signed up for these things regardless of this project, but Joe now knows that I'm doing these things, so
yeah,
he perceives it as competition, but that's not.
I can't let him
what
win.
I'm doing.
Yeah, I think it's amazing to hear all these layers and these stories that goes into the work that you folks are doing. I want to ask one last question, and Joe, you had alluded to, and all of you have alluded to all of the problem solving that goes on into naming these birds. Is there a process for naming birds in a situation? Like maybe it's a bird that is like rare to the territory or something like that, and in all of your travels and conversations you haven't come across a name for it. Is that something you've thought about, or is there a process for that?
Even worse. This is the worst thing, and I had an amazing experience that made the situation even more worse. So my cat used to always bring warblers home. It's like a favorite thing to catch and eat. So she'd always bring these warblers home. So that's how I got to
which we invite all the listeners to avoid. Please keep your cats indoors.
This is like 30 years ago.
Is a problem.
This is like 30 years ago on the res. Yeah, so my cat bring home all these really super colorful warblers. I know they're warblers now, but it's an incredibly diverse family that we have here. Probably, I don't know how many different warblers we have here, like 11 or something like that. So many different kinds, so many different colors, so many different sounds, and it's such a diverse family, and I don't technically and actually have one name of one warbler that we can confirm, even with this dramatic and maybe even excessive method that we have. That's been the most frustrating thing. I was on Manitoulin a couple weeks ago. We were picking medicine, and we were at a puddle. We stopped on the road. There was a puddle. There was like 8 different species of warbler all bathing in this puddle. And I now know a group of warblers that's called a bouquet. So here we were for like a half hour sitting in front of this moving bouquet of bathing warblers. And I could guarantee that I do not have one name of one of those birds ever. So I think one of my most motivating things is to be able to understand what the names of all these super loud, obnoxiously loud and plentiful species of warbler. One name. That's all I want.
Of the 29 species we have in Ontario.
29?
Yeah, man.
Yeah, see, that's super frustrating. There's so many things that we get. I have so many names of like what I think Andres was mentioning earlier. People will give me names of a bunch of birds that they know are birds, but we're sitting in a room, like we're sitting in like a workshop station plate, like a house, and they're just describing what these birds, they're telling me what their names are and trying to describe what they think that it looks like, or they're describing species that they've never even seen before. So it's like, yeah, we got lots of work to do, and got a lot of unknowns we have to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe that's where we'll have to leave it today. You folks have been very generous with your time. I'm sure we could talk for hours and hours. And certainly seems like your project is at the tip of the iceberg. But I hope that the work that you're doing inspires people in other communities to continue and expand this work. So thanks so much for your time today. And yeah, look forward to staying tuned to the updates on this project and seeing what comes of it in the future.
Sweet.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate it. Thanks for your
Pura vida.
time.
That's the Gween Gwish we're listening to now, by the way, aka Whiskey Jack, aka Canada J. Usually when I do an interview, when it's over, I feel like I've asked every question that I want to ask. With this one, I feel like I've barely scratched the surface. Joe, Andres, and Junaid each carry such a wealth of information, and their particular niches work so well together to do with the work that they do. As they mentioned, this project is an ongoing thing, so if you happen to have any information that can help build their Anishinaabe Bird Names library or know someone who does, please drop them a line. You can find them online at creatorsgardenmarket.ca. While on their site, be sure to pick up a copy of the Anishinaabe Bird Names pamphlet. Heck, pick up 5 and give them out to your friends. You can also follow them on Instagram and Facebook, where I'm definitely looking forward to seeing future developments of this project. If you got any feedback on this show or suggestions for other bird-related content you'd like to hear on CKUW, drop me a line anytime at whatsupckUW@gmail.com. I've been your host, Jonny B. Thanks for listening, and looking forward to seeing you out on the trails in the future. Cheers.